We are now going to be demonstrating a supine to sitting at the edge of the bed transfer. So the first thing to do is to inform the patient exactly what is going to be happening so that they can participate as much as possible. This helps so that you don't have to be doing a dependent lift, which is sometimes the case if the patient isn't aware of what's about to happen. So first, our assistant is going to instruct the patient to bend up her knees. If the patient needs assistance, you can facilitate that. Next, our goal is to have the patient roll over onto her side first before attempting to sit up. At this point in time, patients often attempt to reach up towards the assistant and pull on them, which would actually pull the assistant down and be very risky for the assistant. So instead, we want the patient to roll over onto her side. She's going to reach with her opposite hand towards the bed rail, and then the assistant is going to pull her hips over the rest of the way if the patient is too weak to completely roll over onto her side. At this point, the patient is going to bring her legs off of the edge of the bed, one at a time. The assistant can help with that if necessary. And the weight of the legs going down sort of acts as a pendulum, which is actually going to help facilitate the trunk coming up. The assistant is now going to place one hand on the patient's hip and one hand on the space in between the patient's neck and shoulder, or on this side of her shoulder. You never want to be pulling on the patient's arms to help them sit up because that risks shoulder dislocation. At this time, the assistant is going to count out 1, 2, 3, and then she's going to push downward on her hip and lift upward on the patient's shoulder. And she's also going to instruct the patient to help by pushing down through the bed rail. Are we ready? Okay, 1, 2, and 3. Oftentimes, the patient will be situated with her hips far back on the bed at this time, and the therapist or assistant can instruct the patient to scoot her hips forward in order to facilitate more sturdy sitting balance with the feet flat on the floor. We are now going to be demonstrating the proper technique for a sit-to-stand transfer. I'm going to be assisted by Heather and MAURA, who are Northeastern co-op students who are going to be helping us to demonstrate correct body mechanics during this transfer. So the first thing you will notice is that our patient, MAURA here, is situated very far back on the bed. The most important principle that will really help you in assisting a patient from sitting to standing is getting the patient's center of gravity, which is in their hips typically, over their base of support, which is their feet. So we're going to want the patient to scoot forward in order to successfully get her center of gravity over her base of support. Additionally, you'll notice that the patient's feet are also very far out in front of her. So it's important to cue the patient to scoot her base of support back under her and then separate her feet so that she has a nice wide base of support and is more stable once she comes into standing. Next, it's going to be important to look at our assistant's body mechanics. So we also want her feet to be nice and wide, and then we want her to have a slight bend at her hips and her knees with a nice healthy lumbar concave curvature in her low back. What we don't want to see is her upper back rounded forward and a loss of that lumbar curvature. So Heather is going to retract her shoulder blades and maintain that nice concave curvature of her lumbar spine. Then Heather, who is the assistant, is going to cue the patient to put her hands on the edge of the bed, or if she were in a chair, it would be permissible to have her push up from the armrest of the chair. But it's important to never have the patient have their hands up on the walker because the walker is very lightweight and is not going to assist at all in having the patient come forward. So the patient's going to push up off of the bed here. And then our assistant is going to cue the patient to lean forward before she stands up. And then she's going to count 1, 2, 3 so that both patient and assistant are ready at the same time. And then they're going to stand. Heather, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. stand, and then the hands can move forward to the walker. As you'll notice now, the patient has very good posture with her ears lined up over her hips, lined up over her feet. We are now going to be demonstrating a bed to wheelchair transfer. So we're going to be using our sit to stand technique that we already demonstrated in a previous demonstration in order to start this transfer. The important things to note are that you definitely want to plan your transfer ahead of time. That involves establishing a safe environment where the brakes on the bed are locked and the brakes on the wheelchair are also locked prior to the patient actually standing. Another important thing to note is that you may want to consider the patient's strength. So the patient is always transferring towards their strong side if that's applicable. For example, if the patient has had a stroke and they're hemiplegic on one side, you want to make sure that you're transferring them towards the strong side. Sometimes you need to sort of rearrange the environment to make that a safer situation. So first, we are going to use our sit-to-stand technique. So our patient has her hands on the edge of the bed, and our therapist is going to move her hands so that she is guarding the patient appropriately and facilitating the sit-to-stand. Our walker is correctly placed, and our patient's feet are in a good position. On the count of 3, the patient and therapist are going to stand up. 1, 2, 3, lean forward, stand up, and then the patient's hands come up onto the assistive device. At this time, we're going to start the actual transfer towards the wheelchair. So the therapist is going to instruct the patient to pick up her feet and move the walker so that she can back up to the surface of the wheelchair. She wants to continue taking small steps backward, and the patient wants to ensure that both of her legs are against the wheelchair surface before sitting down. The therapist is now going to instruct the patient to move her hands back to the armrest of the chair. And then the therapist is going to bend slightly at her hips and knees to lower the patient into the chair so that she's not compromising her own body mechanics as the patient lowers into the chair. We are now going to be demonstrating a bed to stretcher transfer using a full-length slide board. So the important things to note are that the height of the bed and the height of the stretcher are at the same height so that you're not pulling the patient uphill or downhill. It's much more comfortable for the patient. Next, we want to look at our body mechanics. So our pullers over here on this side are going to arrange their feet in a stagger stance with one foot in front of the other, and their feet should be nice and wide so that they have a nice wide base of support and their balance is better when they're pulling. Next, you want to note that they're going to have a slight bend in the hip and the knee so that they're able to use their quadriceps, their thighs, and their glute muscles to really do the pulling instead of using their upper back and their biceps. So, first things first, we want to have the patient actually bring their lower body across as far as they're able. To sort of get a head start on the transfer. And then we're going to have the patient cross their arms across their chest to contain their body parts. And then our pullers over here are going to grasp the sheet in an underhand grasp, and they're going to choke up so they're nice and close to the patient here. And then I'm just going to come around. As they pull, they are going to just shift their weight from their front foot to their back foot while maintaining a nice lumbar curve in their spine. And I'm going to be over here to make sure that we don't forcefully roll the patient in the opposite direction. Heather is going to count 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to pull.